Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us and sixth part of our series, Serving Patients Experiencing Homelessness. Joining us today will be Melissa Brandt. She is with the Rochester Public Schools. She's the Transitions and Fostering Connections Coordinator, meaning that she works as a homeless liaison. She also works with foster care, and she mostly works with the high poverty Title I schools in the area. And she'll be talking to us basically about how we can best serve patients who we might not necessarily see as homeless, or not the traditional sort of model that we think of. Thank you so much for joining us, and please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Derek, so much. I am so happy to be here to talk to all of you. And I have my PowerPoint up. I have this first quote up from the Post Bulletin, which is Rochester's newspaper. The Nationwide Health and Housing Report showed that Rochester is one of the third worst for housing affordability in the nation. I say that because we're considered an affluent community, and sometimes with affluent communities, you don't always equate poverty, but what it does is it creates a really difficult situation for our skilled and unskilled labor at the kind of the bottom of the socioeconomic status area. So there is quite a bit of poverty in Rochester, and I just like this statistic that as a bit of a grounding and a bit of a thing to be mindful about as we discuss some of what Rochester's poverty looks like. So there's a living wage site that MIT has. If you click on the living wage calculator, it will tell you for whatever county you're in across the board what the living wage would be for example, one adult with one child, one adult with two children, two adults with two children. And say, for example, if we took a very average household, two adults, two children, the living wage in Rochester, Minnesota would be $26.89. So that's what that family would have to bring in terms of hourly wage in order to be able to afford to live in Rochester. This is just a wonderful resource for all of you that I'm putting out there, that if you ever are wondering what the living wage is for that community and knowing what minimum wage is, it's a good way to get an idea about what families are going to need in order to be able to get by in a community. The Wilder study, which is done in Minnesota every 3 years, it goes out one day, knocks on doors, talks to shelters, goes to unsheltered locations where we know families experiencing homelessness might be staying, and interviews them about their situation or their homelessness. Was done most recently in 2018, so it'll be done again this year. And what we found out is that of the families and individuals identified in Minnesota, 46% of those Minnesota individuals are 21 years of age or younger. I say that as a mental reset because I think when you hear homeless, you automatically default to potentially what we see in the media, maybe a middle-aged man or a veteran or someone who's a chronic inebriate or chemically dependent. And all those things are true, but children and youth are a big part of our homeless population as well. So 46% of Minnesota's homeless in the Wilder study were 21 years of age or younger. If you bump that number up to 24, it's 52% of Minnesota's identified homeless. And that is not including families who are doubled up or living with other families. So the majority of Minnesota's homeless are youth, children, and young adults. And that's often a big reset for people. The average age of a homeless student in Minnesota is 7. 95% of Minnesota's homeless youth are actually enrolled in school. And this was again from the Wilder study. That means as a community, we do a great job of enrolling students, but 69% of these students attended school on the day of the survey. So what it means is we're doing a great job enrolling kids. We're not doing such a great job at getting kids to school, getting kids engaged, getting them transportation. Transportation is a big barrier. Access to resources like laundry resources, a barrier for kids. Kids don't want to come to school in clothes that are not clean. All of those kind of things create a barrier that make it difficult for students experiencing homelessness to get to school. So University of Minnesota did a 6-year study. Dr. Ann Madsden, she is really renowned in terms of her research in homelessness, in particular for students. And without question, the academic risk factors that students face, homelessness is the worst. Minnesota's graduation rate for students experiencing homelessness is 42%, which is the worst in the nation. I say that because as someone who works in the field, it's mortifying. It just means we have such a long way to go here in Minnesota to tackle some of this. I just briefly am going to touch on the types of poverty. There are four basic types of poverty: generational, situational, working class, and immigrant. And the reason why I bring up those four different types of poverty is because there are poverty that we can kind of wrap our minds around as adults, and there's poverty that we really struggle with. So we understand situational poverty. Someone's house has burned down, there's been a divorce, there's been a death in the family, there's been medical bills, and the family is struggling to recover. Those are the poverty that we can kind of wrap our mind around and we understand. And it's part of why our thought in this, and I'll use the we as kind of the imperial we as a nation, we understand situational poverty. That's where kind of the bootstrap mentality comes from. Well, that person was able to get on their feet. Why can't you? And that's often reflected in the work that many organizations do. And it's where our judgment comes into play and where we have to kind of set that judgment aside. The most really complicated type of poverty that we struggle with is generational poverty. And generational poverty is when two or more generations of the same family are experiencing poverty. For generational poverty, it means another MIT professor, Peter Temin, has quite a bit of research out there that says you have to have 20 years of none of those situational poverty type events happening for a family in generational poverty, for that family to overcome generational poverty. So no divorce, no car breakdown, no medical bills, no eviction, that sort of thing. And we know that the likelihood of a family continuing 20 years without anything like that happening is slim to very none, which is part of the reason why it's so incredibly difficult to overcome generational poverty. But I do think education is a big part of it. So all of this is a little bit from the deficit lens. So I do want to talk a little bit about the lens about what children and families living in poverty bring to the community. The drive for reliable relationships. What I would say is the families that I work with are some of the most loyal friends that I have made. They know that I'm here for the long haul. And that's the one thing about families who are living in poverty. They are used to people giving up, particularly in generational poverty. They very much see it as a personal problem, not a systemic problem. And so what that means is they are used to people like turning their back and they sort of expect it. So when you show up for a family in poverty and when you truly are there and not bringing judgment, you will find that the drive for reliable relationships is a very important piece that families in poverty bring to the table. Strengthening peer socialization, quest for importance and social status. I'll just talk like super quickly about these. For kiddos or students that I work with who are experiencing poverty, oftentimes will provide them some social status. And we can do this in the classroom by offering a leadership role or give them an opportunity to do an important task that gives the social status that they might be seeking. If we're not offering those opportunities for social status, then what you'll find is they'll seek maybe a more negative opportunity for social status. So we really work to build up our families and talk a lot about the attributes and the wonderful things that families in poverty can actually bring to the community as opposed to the kind of from the deficit model and led. Actions you can take as someone in the medical field: embody respect, embed the social skills that you see, and be inclusive. So what I mean is if your expectation is that, say, for example, and keep in mind, my example might not be a cultural norm across different ethnic communities. So I say, if you expect something like eye contact and a handshake, it's important to model that for families experiencing poverty. And that's not always culturally appropriate. That's what I mean by embodying respect. Always embody it before it's expected, because a lot of times when families come to me, they're very deregulated because they're probably upset about something that's happening at home and that sort of thing. So I always say, I can tell that you care about your children as much as I care about them. Let's figure this out. When you embody that respect is returned to you. Actions that the community take, and I say this all the time, the bold one is the one I'm going to focus on. Put poverty on the agenda. You have to plan for it. We have schools in Rochester Public Schools, for example, that are 70% of the students are on free and reduced price lunch. 70% of those students are experiencing poverty. If we are not talking about how we're changing the system to accommodate those students, we are doing a disservice to 70% of that school. The majority of our schools are closer to the 30% range. Still, 30% is a pretty big percentage of Rochester's population. I think in terms of income in Rochester, it's about 37% of families earn 56,000 or below. So 37%, although that's not the poverty line, it's kind of inching closer to it. If we're not talking about how we're going to accommodate those families, even in the medical field, we're doing a huge disservice to our community. Another thing I always talk about is saying things like, I'm so glad you're here, as opposed to, why are you late? Kids typically in school too are not late on purpose. There's maybe a middle school kid had to get their elementary siblings on the bus and they're consistently late for first hour. We say, we're so glad you're here. How can we help make your day a little bit better and a little bit easier? So those are just suggestions when working with families in poverty. Here's kind of moving over to some of the medical side that you guys probably have studied a lot of this, but our families in poverty are more likely experiencing both chronic and acute stress over a long period of time. They're often exposed to ACEs, so those adverse child experiences. So they're exposed to lots of percentage of ACEs. And we know that when the ACEs go up, academics decrease and attendance decrease. So every one is an additional barrier to success in the educational field and in the classroom. Now, what I would say is I am a child of maybe I think 5 or 6 ACEs, which is a pretty high number of ACEs. But what I would say is I'll speak on the poster child for some of what I recognize I've had quite a bit of advantage just in my skin color, all that sort of thing. But you can come out of the other side. And I want to celebrate kids that there's an opportunity for a lot of success, even regardless of age. Academic results of stress, poverty, and homelessness linked to chronic absences. Kids experiencing homelessness and living in poverty more likely to have long-term illnesses like asthma due to exposure in their environment. ADHD impairs attention and concentration, but ADHD in the classroom at home might be a way to cope with stress as you're continually have to change and be willing to adapt to your environment. We know high levels of cortisol make it practically impossible to imprint things on long-term memory. There's diminished social skills and social judgment, higher likelihood of a lot of those social emotional struggles, and then just reduction in motivation and determination, because long-term poverty, generational poverty, teaches that education ultimately doesn't matter, right? My grandma went through school, my mom went through school, and here we are still struggling. So that's a little bit of what generational poverty kind of brings to the classroom and to the mental health and the health of students. Exaggerated response in the classroom can be a survival technique. I kind of mentioned that already. I just wanted to show this slide so you understand really how impactful poverty is. So the top green line is kind of all students math. That dip is when we change some of the proficiency testing. The red line is free and reduced price lunch students. The bottom line is students experiencing homelessness and math proficiency. So what we see is kids in poverty still exponentially are able to do better academically than our students experiencing homelessness. So it's not a small blip. It is a huge impact on their educational success, which Dr. Ann Masden's work helps support as well. If you look at homelessness and math, here's a little different bar graph to take a look at. You see that again, huge gap in students with non-homeless experience as opposed to students experiencing homelessness. Same outlook for reading. Attendance, Most students are at or above 90%. At the schools district, we really worry when we hit that 10% mark. You can see it starts to drop off as kids get older. That's primarily because students get jobs and they need to bring money to the household and they've not had academic success at that point. So we really start to lose kids in 9th, 10th, 11th grade. So that is my presentation in a nutshell. I'd love to know what kind of questions you guys have.
How has COVID and the transition to online learning and at-home school transformed the landscape and the environment for students who are experiencing homelessness?
That is an excellent question, and thank you for bringing it up, Grace. So for students experiencing homelessness and students in poverty, distance learning has been a challenge because in many ways, some of the same shame framework that comes with, if you're living in a trailer with 22 people, you probably don't want your camera on, you probably don't want your mic on, you probably don't have a private place to go. You may not even have access to the technology that you need. So we have distributed like around 300 right now, hotspot, partnership with Charter to get kids hooked up to the internet, way more than that in terms of devices, thousands of devices to students. I think in our free and reduced price lunch population in Rochester is over the 6,000 mark. For kids experiencing homelessness, it's creating, I will say, a bigger gap. I think there are challenges with all kids in this format. Some kids have really embraced it, but those kids are probably the ones that are going to have success anyway. But for our families in poverty, the access is 10 times harder. Seeking out the mental health supports is really difficult, again, when you don't have those electronic accesses. And then also food insecurity increases. We have meal kits that we're distributing, but we're only distributing probably 1,500 in our times when we distribute them. And that is nowhere near the 6,000 students on free and reduced price lunch that we would feed during the normal school year. So food insecurity becomes a big challenge as well. And then access to that food. We have meal kits and we're distributing them, but if you can't get to those locations, it continues to be a challenge. So students have bigger concerns than sometimes the homework and the check-in.
You pointed out that Minnesota, you said it was 50th as far as graduation rates for homeless children. What do you think is behind that? How are we there? How did we get there? And what have you been doing in your space?
That's a pretty new tracking resource that we've been following. And honestly, it came out, I think, a year or two ago. And it's mortifying. It's incredibly mortifying. As someone's in the field, I take it very personally. I don't even know where to start. The achievement gap is part of it. Actually, this is going to sound crazy, but the weather is kind of part of it. It's harder to get transportation sometimes on, some of those cold days, but that's just like a ridiculous excuse, in my opinion. We don't have good answers yet. Like I said, it's a new statistic. We continue to disaggregate data, and we're looking now at smaller and smaller groups to better understand where those rates are coming from. I suspect it's highly connected to, like I said, our achievement gaps. We know that our Latinx families are also in the 42% graduation rate. If you're African American, you're much less likely to have that graduational success as well. And you're much more likely to be identified as a family experiencing poverty and homelessness. So because those two statistics working together are probably part of the reason why that number is quite so bad. Why it's Minnesota in particular, I don't completely know. I don't know if it's because we have a pretty robust tracking system that maybe we're doing a better job of identification, which is making our numbers higher. I don't know. What I am doing in my world is I am doing outreach to specific communities. I do town halls with our local diversity council. So in the past month and a half, we've done, I think, 13 with our Ethiopian community, Somali community, Cambodian community, Arabic, African American, Hispanic. There are others that are missing, Asian Indian. The nuances of the different ethnic communities helps me better do outreach and model to those communities. so that I can bring, like, we're working on creating videos for Somali communities about the resources available, so that perhaps, because we know Somali is such a new language, many families are not literate. And so videos in Somali language to help connect families to resources, we hope will better increase access to those supports that a family might need, so that kids get to school and know that we can transport if they need transportation, or we can provide devices.
How does it work with the integration of the school and the interface with pediatricians? How does that relationship work, especially for
Yeah,
children experiencing homelessness?
I would say it's actually, there's lots of work to be done there. We have a really good relationship with a lot of our social service organizations, and I think the medical community has a bigger challenge just because of HIPAA, and we have FERPA, and there's crossover in some of those laws. But our biggest challenge is very rarely will I get a referral from the clinic. My referrals come from social workers, school social workers. They come from social workers in our housing redevelopment programs, in our shelter programs. And honestly, the social workers, like at the clinic, I think call me as a last resort, which is kind of a shame, because the school is very connected and is very at the core of support systems for families. And so there is a different relationship, a more kind of familial almost relationship with schools that families have, because they're there every day. And so when I get a call from a social worker at the clinic, they'll say, "Hey, I'm working with this family and they're just not getting to school because they're experiencing homelessness." Then I can say, "We have transportation resources. Here's my information. Please reach out." But I think there's that fear of rights of privacy, and we get so afraid of breaking a rule or doing something wrong that I think it's at the detriment of families. So if I could encourage anything, I would say, if you're going into the field of pediatrician, be connected to the schools. Legally, every single public school system has a homeless liaison. It's federal law. So we are in every single public school district, and we're a connection for tons of resources for physicians.
Thank you so much, Mr. Brandt. It's been great to have you. Thank you for your presentation, and I
Thank you
appreciate
all.
your time.
Best of luck in your program.